Greetings, everyone. I am very excited to again be in conversation with Ray Grasse, who is an internationally known astrologer, writer. He's also a photographer and musician. And I've been delving more into some of your books, Ray. Your experience, 50 years of experience as an astrologer, there's such a wealth of knowledge that you have and wisdom from that experience. And I'd love to focus today on some of your understanding of astrology coming out of those years of experience and how it can be a path for healing and moving into spiritual consciousness for us. And I think this also ties into your very interesting spiritual journey in your own life. But maybe we could start with that in terms of some of your path, in terms of your own spiritual exploration.
Okay. Thanks for having me, first of all. Um, I started studying yogic philosophy and Eastern thought in particular when I was 19, and I started studying with a teacher in Chicago named Goswami Kriyananda. Throughout my teens, I had been reading things like Edgar Cayce and Lobsang, Rampa, and um, Joan Grant's book on Egypt and the OWASP and various books. But it was when I started studying with a teacher. I never had a guru, so I studied with a number of teachers, but they all were valuable to me in different ways. But I was with Kriyananda the longest, probably 15 years in downtown Chicago. And he was an astrologer and quite profound in his occult knowledge of things. And that wasn't my first encounter with astrology, but it was because I had first started studying astrology with Maureen Cleary at the University of Chicago. I mean, excuse me, at Columbia College. She had been at the University of Chicago before she gave up psychology to become a full-time astrologer, which is an interesting story in itself. And over the years, I got deeper into astrology and deeper into understanding the spiritual path for what it is and what it isn't. And the two were going hand in hand. And like I've said to you before, I don't regard astrology as a spiritual path per se, in terms of it doesn't have a practice. You know, you can practice astrology, but it doesn't have a practice of meditation or of mindfulness or whatever. You can apply those things to it, but not in itself, it isn't. But it has an assortment of implications to it that are extraordinary, that do impact on your worldview and your spiritual worldview, and impacts your whole, like you brought up the term healing, the whole notion of, as an astrologer, you are actively involved in healing people in how you say things. You know, that's why it's so important that you don't necessarily have to have a master's degree in, psychology or a PhD to work with clients. You have to have common sense and empathy. You know, you don't want someone leaving your office looking for razor blades, as I like to say. You want them to be feeling empowered over some, even if there is difficulties, you want them to feel like they have tools or that they have a different perspective on it. You know, I worked with NLP for a number of years. There's two key tools in the NLP book, which is anchoring and reframing. There's actually a third one, metaphor. But the whole notion of how do you reframe someone's struggles? And I think astrology gives you tools for doing that in terms of you take a difficult aspect astrologically, a challenging planetary pattern in the horoscope, and how do you reframe it so that they see it as an opportunity? You don't want to sugarcoat. You don't want there is some validity to the criticism of modern astrology as being too, Pollyanna-esque of, oh, you've got a difficult Saturn, what a great opportunity this is. I mean, that's a legitimate criticism because you want people to understand the true challenge that's involved, but in a way that gives them possibilities, that doesn't just narrow them into thinking, oh, I've got a disaster coming up. So anyway, getting back, to the spiritual side of it. So I studied with Kriyananda for a number of years, and then I wound up studying with his teacher. I've written a book about Kriyananda. I've written two books now about his teacher, Shelley Trimmer, who had studied with Yogananda, and he was an independent teacher. He wasn't affiliated with Yogananda's organization. And a remarkable teacher in his own right, profound occult mind, and I think profound mystic. And he had his own attitude and philosophy of astrology that was quite deep, which I've written about as well. And so those were incredible lessons for me that I've incorporated in my own thinking about astrology and in terms of spirituality. They impacted that. Like Kriyananda would say things, he would throw out these pithy sayings that, to this day, 30 years, 40 years later, I still think about, like the one that I like to quote a lot because it's so great. He said, everyone's trying to find God when they haven't even found their humanness yet.
Mm,
I
mm,
mean, that's an amazing statement. The notion that you don't go around your humanity to get to the divine, so to speak. You kind of go through it, things like that. And part of what my own path has been, I feel, I started out, the whole New Age thing was so big when I was younger, especially in the early to mid 70s. This notion of it was very flowery and, very kind of out there. And it kind of left the humanity behind to some extent, as far as the struggles and what's the term that spiritual bypass is the term you hear a lot. And that was very true back then. This notion of you, in order to get to heaven, you kind of, ignore the shadow stuff and all that. And so I wound up, after studying with Kriyananda and Shelley, I felt I needed more work on developing meditation because I've always had a bad case of ADHD, of, the mind wandering, and sitting still was very hard for me. And so I wound up going to Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York in for about 5 months in the mid 80s. And which was a tough experience in some ways for a Gemini like myself to sit still for how many hours a day. It was, on the average, it was 3 hours a day. And then the sessions at the end of the month were roughly 12 hours a day, though you're getting up every 35, 40 minutes. It's not like you're sitting still that long. And had some minor breakthroughs doing that in terms of, taking my meditation to another level, not to any, extraordinary heights, but for me, another level. And so combining that Buddhist background with the yogic background was a very important and very interesting sort of experience for me, because I think that all paths do lead to Rome, more or less. I mean, there are some exceptions to that. But I think that they both wind up in the same place, but they have different paths and different scenery to get there, and different, some might take a car, some might take a horse, some might take, a jet plane, whatever. Um, and then I wound up becoming a full-time astrologer considerably before that. It was, I think, I think my first chart reading I did was right out of college in 74, 75. And I learned the hard way, like a lot of astrologers. The first few years I did astrology, I think back in horror at how amateurish the readings were, and I think, oh, those poor people that came to me for readings, because they just weren't as good as I would like them to have been. Although, again, there's an old saying that people go to the astrologers or the psychics or the tarot readers that they need or that they deserve or whatever, and that's probably true too. So, getting back to the implications of astrology, which is to me a really interesting area. For example, getting to the healing thing, I don't want to forget that. I had a woman contact me, a client contact me a few days ago, whose husband is going through a tough time, and she was asking me for suggestions on therapists that I could recommend for her husband. And I said I would look into that. but I decided to, I said, would you like me to look at his horoscope too? I normally don't offer that sort of thing. I wait till someone asks, but I felt that this was an exception. This is someone I'd known a long time. And so she said, yes, please. And I looked at his chart and I saw he had some, he was undergoing his Saturn return and he had Uranus on his sun. And he had some major things happening. And I don't pretend to be a therapist or psychoanalyst, but I can give them my astrological informed opinion. And so I did, and it really impacted her and her husband because it didn't take away the issues that he was dealing with, and I wasn't trying to, but I was trying to reframe them to some extent and trying to give some understanding of what's going on. And that as an astrologer, you can shine the light of understanding on what they're feeling, and it clarifies that experience, because sometimes when you're in the midst of grief or you're in the midst of confusion, you don't really, it's just like a fog. You don't quite understand it. And sometimes the tools of astrology can help you clarify that. And this is something that my original astrology teacher, Maureen Cleary, she had that background as a psychologist and had worked with James Hillman and all these people. And she made the comment to me once. I said, how has this affected your psychological understanding? Having been an astrologer for several years at that point, she picked it up fast. It was unbelievable. After 1 year, she was an expert astrologer, which is not usually the case. And she said that she learned more as an astrologer from studying someone's chart for, let's say, 2 hours that than she often did working with someone therapeutically for 6 months, which is a very interesting.
Yeah, I can attest as a
Yeah,
clinical psychologist because once I learned astrology, I've often said to other therapists or psychologists now, I feel like if I were working as a psychologist without being able to see the chart, in a way you're flying blind. You're then trying to unpack the person's history, gain enough of a context to know what they're struggling with when it's there in the chart. And tying back into what you said a few minutes ago, Ray, I also feel like as part of the healing process, that it's so helpful for people when they're struggling with something to get the larger context,
yeah,
meaning to what that struggle may be about. And as I know you also believe, the chart helps us understand at a more spiritual level what the soul self may be trying to work out, that the personality maybe self may be really struggling with. But again, I think when people get a sense of the deeper meaning of this is something I'm working through as part of my own growth and evolution, it creates a whole different awareness and process of how they're working that crisis.
yeah. That's we could talk about that for hours, but the one example that came to mind here was I had a client where Saturn was in the woman's birth chart. She had Saturn trining her Venus. But when she came to me, Saturn was squaring her Venus. Now, there's an old saying that everything, whatever, only that can happen in your chart that is there natally, that is there in your birth chart. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So she was going through this horrible time in her marriage. The Saturn was squaring her Venus, but the natal chart showed the trine, which is a strong, very positive sort of energy. And I said, I talked about that in terms of there was a developmental struggle, maybe even on an initiatory sort of struggle that she's dealing with of love, what love means and what partnership means. But the chart implied to me it was going to work out, that whatever happened, whether she stayed with that man or not, this was going to work out in some way for the better. And I could say that honestly to her because of the natal trine. Or you take the example, what comes to mind here is Tina Turner. I've used this example before, how she had Saturn trine Venus. which can show, what I often talk about is Saturn, the late bloomer. That's the name of my one essay that's,
Mhm.
in one of the
An
books that's
excellent
online.
essay, by the way.
This,
Yes.
well, this idea that whatever Saturn touches tends to involve a lot of hard work to kind of develop. And so Tina Turner had a T square to the, I think it was Mars in the seventh, which is hardship and some difficult fighting in marriage, perhaps, but it also was her dynamic, sexy presence on stage. But there's a lot of conflict there. But the Saturn was trining Venus, which, if she had come to me, which she didn't, of course, but if she had come to me, I would have said, "You're probably going to wind up, in a much better place, because of these hardships, or as a result, or maybe in spite of." And she wound up, getting married, and that, I think, was he a Swiss or a, businessman, and she had I think, a happy life in Switzerland or wherever it was towards the end. And you can give the context, like you say, of someone's life, not always that clear cut, but it's pretty remarkable what astrology can tell you if you know how to read it, especially in terms of that late bloomer thing, which is, to me, if there's any one thing I had to leave behind in terms of my writings about astrology, it would be that one essay, Saturn the Late Bloomer, because I can't tell you how many times I've talked to clients where I hear from them later and they say the most important thing I took away from our talk was the fact that you said it's going to get better, or there's a reason for these challenges. It's anyway, so I wanted to add that to the picture.
Yeah, and that's an excellent essay. I really, really enjoyed reading that. But part of what you also talk a lot about, Ray, is that part of the gift of astrology is that it gives us that level of consciousness or the witness self that can see these themes that we're dealing with in our lives, see the strengths and the challenges, and then work it more consciously.
Yeah. It's I have an essay in one of the books, Stumbling Across the Script, I think is the title. And I use this thought experiment, which I'll revise a little bit here. Imagine if you found out that there is a script tucked away somewhere about your life, of how your life is going to unfold or has unfolded, down to even, the details of your life in terms of where you're going to move, or what your psychology is going to be like, and what marriage is going to be like. And you stumble across this script. And what would your reaction be if you suddenly saw this and realized that your whole life was laid out in advance, to some extent? There would be a real existential shock that I think you would have. You would realize, wait a second, I thought I was a free agent. I thought that I was doing what I was doing out of impulse or out of choice. And then you realize, wait a second, it's not that simple. I'm somehow programmed. And there is a good and a bad to that. The bad is that you realize you've been a robot to a certain extent in your life. The good is that once you realize what the program is, you can choose not to react to it, or you can be more conscious. Let's say you see a Mars coming up to square your moon in the chart, which normally would tell you that you're going to be impulsively angry in response to something. Someone's going to push your buttons. Well, you can choose not to if you're especially aware in advance that that's going to come up. There's a story I've related about the late comedian Norm Macdonald. He was, I guess, in a Twitter exchange with the famous scientist biologist Richard Dawkins, saying how we're genetically hardwired. And Norm Macdonald, bless his heart, asked a very profound question. He said to Richard, he said, if we're aware that we're hardwired, are we still really hardwired? If you can stand back and see what the hardwiring is, are you still a slave to it? And Richard didn't know how to answer that. As bright as he was, he could not come up with a response to that. And so I would transpose that question into astrology in terms of, if you're aware of your chart, well, let me start again with that. There's a saying that I heard once in the yogic community, that you're not free of your karma till you first know what it is.
Mm.
And now you can know that through just self-observation, but you can also know that through your chart or having, a psychologist tell you or a guru tell you or whatever it is. But it's by the same token, you're not really free of your chart till you know what it is, and there are certain subtleties. Yes, were you going to say something?
Well, it's just interesting in terms of what you're describing, Ray, because one of the points that you make pretty strongly is your sense that astrology is not about predictability or causality, but very much about synchronicity and symbolism. But do you think, in terms of the script that you're describing, that perhaps that script, that chart, those energies we're born into, are what our soul in between lives decided we needed for our own growth and evolution? And then we come in and experience that. The chart then becomes that map or blueprint of what our soul's intentions were, which is very much the way I see it coming through the lens of evolutionary astrology. But then
Yeah.
once we see the chart and kind of know that script that we laid out for ourselves in this lifetime, we can more consciously work that process. And
Yeah.
I think it was, uh, I think you quote Shelley Trimmer at one point as saying one of his critical statements was the importance of that awareness of, I'm aware that I am.
Yeah.
In other words, that self-awareness is what allows us to make choices with how we deal with these energies that we've been born into with the chart.
Boy, there's a lot to, I could go in 1,000 directions from all that you've just said there. Yeah, it all boils back down to self-awareness. I am that I am. The four-lettered name of God is the way Shelley talked about it. Moses goes to the mountaintop, which is a metaphor for enlightenment, and he asks the name of God, and it's basically I am. I am aware that I am. It's an uncanny, mystical story, metaphor, you might say. And Shelley tied that into the four elements of astrology: earth, water, air, fire, the observer, the observed, the act of observing, and the memory tract, and all this. I mean, he goes into a very deep analysis of what astrology is really about in terms of the architecture of consciousness at its most basic. But boy, I had a lot of thoughts go through my head when you were talking. How did you start that discussion?
Do you, because you're talking about a script as if we're
Yes.
predestined
Oh,
to
yeah, yeah, yeah. Let
life,
me,
and yet you talk so much about astrology as acausal. It's not
yeah,
about predictability and causality, but it's synchronicity and
yes.
symbolism.
My friend Richard Tarnas has a great line, which is one of the great lines in astrology when he said, "Astrology is archetypally predictive, not concretely predictive." And so the chart is an archetypal blueprint of who you are, but you have a lot of leeway in terms of how you're going to work that and manifest it. And a metaphor that I often use is sheet music. You can give a piece of sheet music to Vladimir Horowitz, and you can give it to a 2-year-old, well, or someone that can read music that isn't very good at it, and it'll be a very different piece of music. That's why I think you'll see twins with very similar horoscopes. One goes into a life of crime and the other joins the priesthood. But that gets into another topic. But
But if I could just add to that,
yeah,
Ray, I think you gave a great example in one of your books about Michael Jordan
yeah,
and and his energy in Pisces. And I had a client once that I saw who I didn't know. I was just doing a reading with this person coming to me. She had a stellium in Pisces, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and I thought, I'm going to be encountering this incredibly mystical spiritual person. Instead, she was obsessed with running and shoe design, and Pisces is associated with
yeah.
feet. So it really taught me that we can have these archetypal themes in our chart and then choose to manifest them in different ways, I think, depending on our level of consciousness.
There's there's an example I've used. It might be in that same book that the Michael Jordan one is. I'm not sure, which is a fascinating story in itself. But I had a woman come to me who had Venus in Capricorn, and she had been married twice, and both times she had been married on mountains. Now, Capricorn rules mountains. And so that's something, how do you explain that to a scientist, someone that wants to understand astrology through a conventional, whether it's quantum physics or electromagnetism or gravity? It's useless because it's a language of symbols. But the punchline to that story is that she had a twin brother who also had Venus in Capricorn. He never got married on mountains. As I recall, he painted pictures of the elderly. He painted elderly faces. That was his forte. But you might have found another person with Venus in Capricorn who raised goats. Or you might find another person that, oh no, that was the twin brother had a love of architecture. That's what it was. But I had another client at another time that had Venus in Capricorn at the top of the chart, and they specialized in either paintings or photographs of the elderly. It's the same archetypal principle in each of those. That's the through line there. But it's manifesting very, very differently, which of course, it's not just a matter of temperament, it's a matter of the whole chart. You've got to look at all the factors. So I'm simplifying this to make a point. But it ties back to the doctrine, the ancient doctrine of correspondences, that there is this language, that the universe speaks in symbols. It isn't just about facts and data. That's a valuable level in itself, but there's the subtext of symbols and archetypes in our experience and in the world itself. And there's a great quote of Emerson. Let me see if I have it here on the notes. People have known about, yeah, here it is. Secret analogies tie together the remotest parts of nature as the atmosphere of a summer morning is filled with innumerable gossamer threads running in every direction, revealed by the beams of the rising sun. This notion that there is this hidden infrastructure to our experience of archetypes, of symbols, and things are connected in ways that we can't quantify, like gold is connected to the sun, and that's connected to kings and queens, and that's connected to the heart and the body, and that's connected to eminence in terms of fame. There's this subtle language of symbols and archetypes. And to me, that's been one of the most interesting aspects. It's like a occult science, and it takes a metaphoric perception to see these. You can't find these things through a microscope. You can't find these things you can't put a copy of Moby Dick on a bathroom scale and measure the meaning of the book, your meaning, symbolism, these hidden connections and analogies. These are all things that astrology kind of is based on. So it can't help but understand, it can't help but illuminate your worldview in certain ways. And for example, one of the more astonishing stories that I've had as an astrologer that I relate in one of my writings was I had a client, she's now passed on, but she had a very difficult energy coming up. I think it was something with Mars or Neptune. And I was a little concerned. She didn't drink, so, Neptune in a bad case can be someone having problems because they're drinking or drugs or whatever. But I knew she lived by the seashore. She lived in New Jersey. And I said, you might want to be a little careful around this time frame. She occasionally would go sailing, and I said, you can do what you want to. I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's not my job, but you're paying me to give you some advice. And I'm saying, if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't be out on the ocean right at that particular time. So she didn't. But what happened is she called me like about a week after this happened. And she said, the damnedest thing happened. She said, I was driving down the highway and there was a pickup truck coming from the other direction with a boat. It was towing a boat, a sailboat or something like that. And the hitch came unhitched and the boat came sailing over the guy's truck into the oncoming lane and missed her car by like an inch or something like that. Now, how do you explain that in mechanistic ways? You know, if you're trying to understand astrology in terms of some mechanistic theory, you're going to fall on your face. This is the implication there is that the world speaks in symbols. You know, what does Neptune have to do with boats? What does it have to do with water? What does it have to do with drugs? You know, what does it have to do with illusion or carelessness? All these things. There's all these, hidden correspondences. And to me, that speaks volumes about, one of the implications of astrology is it implies a very different worldview. There are three levels to this, by the way, and I've talked about this a little bit. How um, I remember one of the things that Kriyananda spoke about, and Shelley too, in the early days, when I was first studying with them, was that there are three levels of meaning: the personal, the collective, and the universal. So if you have a dream of a bicycle, well, that has a personal meaning for you, but it has a cultural meaning, but it also has a universal meaning as a kind of a mercurial sort of third house symbol. Well, by that same token, the symbol, the world speaks in symbols, but there are these three levels. There is the level in which your personal life has this dimension, this symbolic language, but there is also the cultural level, which is mundane astrology in the simple terms of how are the events of the world reflected in the planetary and zodiacal sort of patterns. And then you've got the universal level, which is kind of like what Shelley was talking about when he goes into what do these things mean as universal principles? Like, what does Mercury mean? In one of my books, I talk about you can relate mathematical principles to the planets, like, Venus relates to um, like the plus function. Jupiter is the multiplication function.
Mm.
Mars is well, it's also the square, but it's I think it would be division, and Saturn would be subtraction, and so on. You can see universal principles here. And so astrology, once you open the door, you can go quite
Well,
far in terms of the
yeah,
implications of this.
it's so multi-layered, and even within the symbolism and the archetypes, it's
Yeah,
so many dimensions and layers of meaning. But I want to go back a minute to this
yeah,
boat experience.
yeah,
Because one of the things, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about this, because one of the things that I'm very careful about as an astrologer, I continually say to my clients, I do not see astrology as predictive or deterministic. I think it's about energy patterns and archetypes. And what you do with those energies is your choice. And part of what I see with challenging aspects or transits coming up for someone, and this is where, for me, the level of consciousness with which we're engaging our lives. I mean, you're talking about personal consciousness, collective consciousness, cosmic consciousness. But I also see within our own individual experience, we can have, as Jeff Green would say, the level of consciousness that is about living at consensual reality, which is very much ego consciousness, or what he would describe as individuated consciousness, where you're really much more self-reflective on what's going on in your life and your choices, or spiritual consciousness, where you're really making decisions more from that soul level. So for me, if I see a challenging transit coming in someone's chart, I often see that if they're working that at a deeper level of emotional and or spiritual consciousness, the transit is experienced as an internal process and transformation. But if they're resisting what I think the transit is trying to bring into their awareness, it may occur as an event.
yeah. There's a belief in certainly in the yogic field that the event has to manifest one way or another, but that may simply be symbolically. In other words, like the very first horoscope reading I ever had, the woman talked about Saturn going through my, coming up to go into my fourth house, which is home, domesticity, family. And she said the possible range of things that could happen. And she said, but it could also be, uh, like, and she meant this somewhat flippantly, but I get her point. She said it could also be losing a home while playing Monopoly. So, like it could have been, something happening in the house. It could be losing a family member. It could be something purely symbolic. And that, like, there's a story, it might be apocryphal, but it's a story in Yogananda's autobiography about his teacher. There was you couldn't get away with this now. But Sri Yukteswar, I think, threw a hot coal. They were sitting around a fire, and Sri Yukteswar threw a hot coal at a disciple to had him catch it. And when Yogananda quizzed him about that, he said, I spiritually saw him maybe dying in a house fire the next day. So I needed to burn off some of that karma symbolically. Now, again, like I say, you would never do that now, not in this, this environment. But there is a belief that you can kind of do substitution rituals to kind of work off difficulties so that externally something still may have to manifest. But you can internalize it, like you're saying, in the sense of, well, an example. I had that I've used this very often because it, to me, really, it struck me so hard at the time. I had two clients come to me, two different men, about a week apart, and it turns out synchronistically they were born around the same time. They had basically this very similar horoscopes. The Neptune was in the same degree. And they both had Saturn coming up to hit their Neptune in a hard way. And or maybe they had just gone through this. I'm trying to remember exactly the sequence of this. Well, to make a long story short, the one fellow, when the Saturn hit his Neptune, he was arrested for drunk driving. The Saturn was the authority figures clamping down on his escapism and irresponsibility. And, fate came in from the outside to kind of, test him, so to speak. The other fellow, I asked him what happened when Saturn squared the Neptune or conjuncted whatever it was. And he said he joined AA. So, in other words, the one fellow, the karma kind of came in from the outside and grabbed the bull by the horns, and he got thrown into jail that night. And the other one handled the Neptune from the inside out. He manifested in a very different way. He decided to use free will to kind of manifest the Neptune through kind of in a much, it was for him a very spiritual experience, finally breaking free of that addiction. It was a liberating sort of thing for him. So that may tie into what you were touching on there.
Exactly, because I was really impressed by the article. I'd actually read it, but you encouraged me to read it again for today. That really is about kind of the meaning of suffering and why do we experience some of what we experience here on the earth plane. And you talk about how we go through these different experiences actually as part of our growth and evolution and deepening in compassion. So from my perspective, the incarnational experience that we have here and the chart that we choose to come in with is some of our soul's intentions for our growth and increasing spiritual consciousness, deepening and understanding. So that then how we work with that chart really relates to how we're in that process. And from my perspective, things happen in the outer realm if we're not allowing ourselves to work those energies in a more conscious way with the witness self, with the soul self.
Yeah.
Then it's almost like the universe has to wake us up with some outer experience. But part of what I see, both on the individual level and the global level, is when we're working these energies of the transits or of the shifting of the ages consciously, then it's all about our increasing growth and evolution and spiritual consciousness. which I think is why we're here individually, why we're here collectively. But when we are not participating in that process and we're in disconnection and separation from the energies of cosmic consciousness, then it will play out in a more direct way to wake us up. And I see that happening as we're moving into the age of Aquarius. I see that happening in people's individual lives. So for me, that's kind of that perspective that it's telling us what the energies are that are coming, but not in a way that it means that we have to get caught in fear or feel like we're living in an experience of predictive energies that are going to happen whatever we do. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The Greeks had a word telos, Telos, which was the notion of purpose, like the telos or the purpose of an acorn is to become an oak tree. And, there is this relatively modern view of astrology, a teleological view of astrology, which Jeff Green, I think, embodied that to a great extent, but it was there before through Jane Rudyard and Mark Edmund Jones, and my teacher, Maureen Cleary, talked about self-actualizing astrology. This idea that, you can see events as stepping stones if you decide to. Um, and this does apply on the cultural level. I posted something on social media yesterday. I don't know if I can quote it very well, but this notion of um, like what's happening in the world right now, we're dealing with all of these difficulties and some pretty horrible things going on all over the place. And you can choose to get depressed about that or be the victim. But one of the values, if there's any value at all to being alive at this time and times like this, or in Ukraine or Gaza or wherever it might be, it's that these difficulties more or less force us to take a stand and clarify our principles and decide whether we are going to A, do something about it, like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, or we're going to just, stand by and watch it happen passively and not do anything. So on a cultural level, I think that, there's a reason, I can't prove this, but I think there's a reason why we incarnate at the times we do, because we can bemoan our fate in terms of why did I come at this particular horrible time? But, times like these where great people are really made, I think, in terms of clarifying who they are and what they need to do in the world.
And one of the points that you discuss about Shelley Trimmer's work, and I won't be able to articulate it quite exactly, so you can correct me, but he talks about the path of spiritual growth is about learning balanced self-consciousness, and that he would define the divine or God as the ultimate balanced self-consciousness, but that we as humans tend to be very out of balance. So it felt to me like he views astrology or our life experiences as those activations of our self-consciousness to help us come back into balance, come back into alignment, come back into higher consciousness. And then, and this is my sense, and tell me if this is correct from his perspective, but from that spiritual perspective, then once we fully come into center, you know, alignment with the central channel, alignment with the soul self and spiritual consciousness, then we're the eye of the storm. Then we're not controlled by the circumstances around us, whatever they are. We're,
Yeah,
we're living in that soul consciousness. And my sense is the chart ultimately is guiding us in how to integrate all these facets of ourselves and all these energies that we've been moored into to come to center, where then we're no longer controlled by any of those aspects, or our lives aren't determined by the transits that are happening to us. We're functioning from that place in the center and from that place of spiritual consciousness. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And there's a lot I could say about that. One of the things on a very practical level, people might say, well, how do I get to that point of balance? A very simple method that they talk about in the yogic tradition is watch your breath. Always remember to kind of keep your breath even, because the first thing that tends to happen when emotions enter the picture in a negative way is your breath tightens up. It's like as I'm sitting here talking, as my mind kind of gets going, I notice that my breathing can get very tight, and I have to slow down and kind of take a deep breath and maybe even hold my breath for a few seconds. That's one thing. But I remember being very impressed many years ago, looking at films on TV of Martin Luther King in the middle of marches where things are being thrown at him. And he was the center of the hurricane. Because if I were marching down the street and people were throwing things at me, I'd be getting very pissed. And yet he never seemed to show that anger, or that, that was a great lesson for me. Or the time that I've talked about as well, where I was driving down the road once, and I saw maybe a 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid go into the street. He didn't realize the crossing gate had just gone up at the railway, and he goes into the street and gets hit by a car. I saw this right in front of me. It was a traumatic thing to see. And everybody that was at the intersection, my friend that I was with and all the other people in the other cars, everybody was shocked except one woman. She calmly got out of her car, quickly but calmly got out of her car and tended to the guy on the young man on the street. He was knocked out and in very bad shape. And I later found out, I talked to her, I said, how could she, she was the center of the hurricane, so to speak. She had been an emergency room nurse. So it wasn't that she was cold or detached in a negative way, but she was detached in a healthy way. She was balanced enough that she could, step out of that emotionality that the rest of us were in and deal with the situation. So that detachment isn't about losing your emotions or your empathy. It's about learning how to stay balanced, but not overly emotional to situations. And if grief comes up, that's okay. It's not like you never feel grief, you never feel joy. It's that, you move into progressive states of balance. The way Shelley talked about it using occult terms. He talked about the path of the seven versus the path of the 12. The path of the seven is right up the middle of the spine, the seven classical planets in their balanced state. Whereas each of those chakras has an imbalanced expression to the right and left. Imbalance doesn't mean bad, by the way, but you've got, let's say, take the Saturn chakra at the bottom, the Muladhara root chakra. And it's a balanced state. That is a state of stillness. It's kind of a root grounding sort of energy. But in its masculine expression, its extroverted expression, that's Aquarius, and its feminine expression, it's Capricorn. Those aren't good or bad. It just depends on what you do with it. Those are on the wheel. That's the path of the 12. So, straight and the narrow is what, the term that you see in the ancient text. And being on the wheel, you will be crucified eventually on the wheel if you're not careful, if you only stay on the wheel. And the balance, there's a story that it's a little bit involved, but I think it's worth relating. After Shelley's wife died, Kriyananda went down to see him and to help him get his affairs in order. Shelley was, I guess, in his 50s at the time, and Kriyananda is about 10 years younger than Shelley. He went down there and he said that as he sat on the couch and watched Shelley kind of walking around the room and talking, he said that it was a remarkable thing to see that Shelley was perfectly balanced in the middle of his spine. And I said to Kriyananda, I said, what's the big deal about that? And he said, to be moving around, you almost have to be on the wheel. You have to be in Ida Pingali and the nadis off to the right and left. And he said somehow Shelley was able to be balanced in the middle and yet move around and talk and all this. He said the exact words where he said it was a great occult education. But then what happened, and this is, I think, an important footnote to the story. Shelley asked Kriyananda, how's your mother doing? Because Kriyananda's mother had been in the hospital. And Kriyananda said, oh, she fell out of the hospital bed and broke her hip. And Kriyananda said, with clairvoyant vision, and I do believe he was because I had some personal experiences that tended to validate that. He said that Shelley, at the moment that Kriyananda said that about his mother, he said he saw a burst of loving energy go off from Shelley's heart chakra off to Kriyananda's mother. And what Kriyananda said about that was he said the incredible unselfishness of the man. Now,
Mm.
but the reason I bring that up is that in order to do something in the world like that, to send healing energies towards Kriyananda's mother, Shelley had to angulate himself. He had to go onto the wheel, so to speak. He had to go off from that balance point to send that energy off. So it's not that the wheel is bad. It's not that if, you can use it in occult ways and for power, and you can use it negatively, or you can use it to save lives or to heal people or whatever. It's not an inherently bad Shakti energy, but it can be used either way depending on what you do with it. Now, that's a long-winded way of addressing the point that you raised.
But if I'm understanding what you're saying, and we talk about the wheel then as either different facets of ourselves or different aspects of life, our experience of moving through the world, if you're coming from the center, as Shelley was, if you're coming from that soul consciousness, you can choose to
That's the
engage
key. Yeah, absolutely.
and enter into experiences, but you don't identify with them and you're not bound by them.
Yeah.
You know how to come back to center. Whereas when we're caught on the wheel, we're caught in identification with these experiences, this personality self, these feelings I'm having. We're not in the witness self, the observer, or aligned with the soul self that knows, oh, this experience is guiding me in this growth or this healing or this transformation. I can come back to center and integrate that. And to me, that's some of the key and some of the gift of astrology is it guides
Yeah.
us in how to work our experiences from that witness self, from that spiritual consciousness, so that it's all about growth and evolution and we're not controlled by the circumstances of our lives or our personality characteristics. We're much more in the observer self and able then to use it for our spiritual growth.
Yeah, the more you can become anchored in that state of balance, the more you can be in the world, but not of the world, so to speak. That old biblical saying. And like Shelley used to say that, you know, sex isn't bad, drugs aren't necessarily bad, uh, fame isn't necessarily bad. It's a question of who's controlling who. If let's say, you don't have any control over that bottle of whiskey or whatever, that's it's controlling you. But
Mhm.
if you are anchored in that middle channel and you have that, that firm foundation in that state of balance, you can choose whether to take or leave something. And it becomes and that's where Tantra, is very often misunderstood. That it's not just about the fact that it's not just about sex, it's about the world engaging the world. How do you use certain things like sex or drugs or whatever it might be, or food, as tools. And you can't do it as long as you're on the wheel, as long as you're enmeshed in the world and you don't come from that point of balance. If you're in that point of balance, you can use those things as tools to enhance your awareness, to kind of transform. It's a transformative sort of practice. That's my understanding of it anyway.
Well, and it fits with how you talk a lot in your writing about the importance of integrating ancient wisdom with our modern understanding. And it feels to me like a lot of the ancient cultures understood how you could use plants or use these different ritual experiences to move into expanded consciousness versus in our modern cultures those things become addictions or escapes or end up controlling us rather than being used in a very conscious process for our own expansion.
Yeah. And it ties back on a very practical level to getting your ordinary life together as far as alleviating stress, alleviating financial concerns as much as possible, leaving time to kind of, whether it's for recreation, and I like that word, by the way, to recreate.
Mm.
This whole notion of, I was listening to an interview with Gabor Mate. I think that's how his name is pronounced. Brilliant Jewish doctor who survived the Holocaust, I believe, as a young child. And he was talking about the one regret he has looking back on life is that he didn't leave more time to play or to have fun. It was all work and seriousness and trying to prove himself and all this. And, at Yogananda, this is something that Shelley talked about because he knew Yogananda very well. And Yogananda, to be very frank, got burned out by the responsibilities of running an organization, SRF. And he died at just 59.
Mm.
And towards the end, I don't want to get too much into details about this, but I really think he burned out early and that he was ready to go. He didn't want to deal with this nonsense anymore because he wanted to be liberated from, being a CEO basically. And so he told Shelley, "You stay free." That's his exact words. Don't get too enmeshed in the worldly, rat race, so to speak, the hamster wheel, because how do you find balance when your life is out of order like that? And so, I think that's an important key. It's not always easy, of course, when we've all been having major struggles to some extent these last few years, whether it's COVID or financial issues or whatever. But, I thought it was interesting. One of the things that Shelley, uh, he studiously avoided fame. He did not want to be known about. And that's why I was lucky to get to know him through Kriyananda because he would have people show up at his door, in the middle of the day and just, want a blessing or whatever it is. And so he didn't have a phone until the very end of his life. He did not want, any real publicity, that sort of thing, because he felt that fame was a trap. He felt that
Mm.
if you want to be free, do not go after fame, do not go after, well, even success to some extent, although that I shouldn't say that, that's a bad word. But he felt that, like even the Beatles, people that are in positions of great attention and responsibility, sometimes you have to be. I realize that. But he said that it can be a trap. It can keep you from yourself to a great extent. You can get so caught up in the responsibilities and the demands of the world that there's no time left for yourself.
Well, you end up, and I think he described how you end up carrying these collective projections or archetypes for the collective. So you're no
Yeah,
longer just in your own personal experience, you're
yeah,
embodying something for the collective consciousness, which puts an enormous weight on you, which I'm sure Yogananda felt also.
yeah. Like, well, he told the story about the time that Yogananda was, I think he had just given a talk. And all these people, as they were filing out, were talking to Yogananda and asking him for favors and can you do this and can you heal that and so on. And Yogananda came over to Shelley afterwards and said, "This may look great to you, but this is not, in my words, fun." He really was drained by it. And I remember reading, I think the same thing happened to Rudolf Steiner. I
Mm.
think he was a Pisces, and um, he wound up getting, I think, very burned out by all the demands and helping people. The boundary issue thing becomes very serious if you're an empathic personality. How do you walk that tightrope of helping people and helping the world, but not to a dysfunctional degree where you wind up going down with the ship, so to speak. And that's something I've written about with Neptune. You can
Yeah.
see that in charts very strongly. You'll see, if I see Neptune right on the angles, especially the first or seventh, but sometimes the 10th, like Abraham Lincoln had, or sometimes the fourth, or let's say Neptune in hard aspect or close aspect to the sun or the moon, you can almost predict with 100% certainty that the person's going to have a major lesson in this lifetime around caretaking, around rescuing.
Yes, and I often, with people that have those kinds of very strong Neptune aspects, say it is not a luxury for you to take alone time. It's a necessity because that's the only way you can come back to your own energy, your own process, because otherwise you're constantly absorbing what's going on around you, and
Yeah,
that can burn you out.
yeah. And you see that often in the charts of, great healers or even movie stars, where people demand things of them. And um, even Malala's chart, it is a tightrope, and the more empathic you become, the bigger, the danger becomes. It's tricky. You can be too sensitive. You don't want to be cold, but boy, it's you have to leave time for yourself.
Well, any other reflections that you want to share, just as you kind of, look back over these 50 years that you've immersed yourself in astrology? Any other insights or reflections that you want to share before we close?
A couple things. One is that to me, one of the most startling implications of astrology, excuse me, that I've written about a bit, which is the fact that astrology works even after you're dead, where you'll see a person pass away and the chart continues to work. For example, the one example that I like is I studied a little bit with Joseph Campbell. He would come through town every year, and I would sit in on the workshops that he would do or the seminars. It might be James Joyce one year, it might be the Arthurian legends the next year, and so on. And then he died right before his Uranus return, which happens around age 84. And I knew enough about astrology to think, well, golly, I wonder what's going to happen, And then the Bill Moyers interviews came out on PBS, the Power of Myth series, which you can now find, I think, on YouTube. I might be wrong about that. Extraordinary. And suddenly he burst into worldwide fame around 84 years old, posthumously. Or you see, for example, Martin Luther King, when his Uranus return happened when he was 84. I mean, after he had died, and then they built that statue in Washington, D.C., a stone statue. He was a Capricorn, so that fits in. Or Orson Welles, right when his Uranus return happened after he had died was when there was this resurgence of interest in him, and he was suddenly now on a postage stamp, and Citizen Kane was being resurrected in, various forums and that sort of thing. And the reason I find that so interesting and provocative is how can the chart work after you're dead? If you believe, like a lot of people do, that astrology is some kind of mysterious rays that come down from the stars or some quantum mechanical sort of processes, what are they acting on? The person's dead. It's like the way I've sometimes said it is that we are memes in the cosmic imagination, so to speak. And so the astrology continues to work on the meme of, Ray Grasse or Heather Ensworth, or whatever it might be. You may pass away, the spirit may pass away, but your personality is still a reality. That never quite goes away. Julius Caesar is still a meme, a living meme in the collective divine imagination, so to speak. There's so many different implications to astrology that I think are fascinating like that. And the other point I wanted to mention here, and then we'll probably wrap it up here because I'm starting to lose my energy a little bit here, is that to me, even though astrology is not a spiritual practice, it does have implications for some of us that imply that there is some kind of divine mind or divine imagination at work, because how could all of these things coalesce and integrate the way they do? Again, it ties into synchronicity, which is, my studies in synchronicity paralleled on a different track. My studies into not only astrology, but yogic mysticism and esoteric philosophy, because synchronicity really does imply an integrated whole of things tying like some great novel. Like when you read Moby Dick or War and Peace, these things, the events all fit together in some almost miraculous way. And astrology and synchronicity imply that. How is it possible that that boat came over my friend's car at the moment it did when the Mars Neptune was firing in her chart? That person driving that pickup truck that was hauling the boat had nothing to do with her chart directly. She didn't have some historical connection, family connection to the guy. What brought those things together in the environment the way it did? And I could cite a million examples like that, where it implies something bigger that's organizing the events, like an orchestra, directed by a conductor. And there's a quote. I'll read this here. Um, I don't know which book this is from. It might be from Under a Sacred Sky. Whatever labels or terms one chooses, the phenomenon of synchronicity hints at a coordinating agency of unimaginable scope and subtlety whereby all the coincidences and correspondences of the world coalesce as if threads in a grand design, and within which our lives are holoscopically nested. Seen in this way, the synchronistic event, and I could say the astrological event too, can be seen as affording us a passing sideways glance as if through a glass darkly into the mind of God. So, astrology and synchronicity don't prove God, of course, but they imply there's some coordinating intelligence or principle. Plotinus used the term the one, which is
Yeah.
a neutral, term you can use if you don't like something, anthropomorphic. But however you slice it, there's something there with the more you do astrology, the more you start to see some kind of cosmic design that's at work here, which can change your life if you really take that to heart. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, beautifully said, Ray. That's a great note to end on. And I think it certainly fits with what we're beginning to understand about modern physics, about work by Jude Currivan, Nassim Haramein, that we live in a holographic universe and that everything is consciousness and everything is interconnected. And we're each a fractal expression of that cosmic consciousness.
Yeah.
And it all has meaning. So thank you. Thank you for being in this
Thanks
conversation.
for having me. Thank you.
And blessings and love to all of you.